Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Great Leadership. My guest today is Rachel Cooke. She's a former director of HR at American Express, host of a very popular podcast that I recently had the opportunity to be a guest on called The Modern Mentor. And she's also the founder of a company called Lead Above Noise. And we're doing a little bit of a podcast swap. So people who listen to Rachel's podcast are going to hear from me on the topic of leading with vulnerability, a little bit about work stuff. And then those of you who are listening to my podcast today, we're going to be talking a little bit about employee experience, workforce trends that everybody should be paying attention to. We'll get into why a lot of leadership development programs inside of organizations fail. And then for the very end of the show, the Leaders Toolkit section, we're going to be talking about a framework that Rachel has on how to activate teams inside of organizations. So Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. I mean, you've interviewed a lot of people on your podcast, so you probably have a lot of really cool insights from some of the work that you've done. Why don't we get started with some background information about you? Because obviously you were doing a lot of really cool HR stuff at American Express. What's your background? How did you get involved in all the stuff that you're doing?
Sure. The really short story is I went to college thinking I was going to be a therapist. I came out of college thinking I mostly needed a therapist, but I loved the study of psychology. I did not feel I had the maturity to be an individual therapist, and I landed on the field of organizational psychology. And I thought, ooh, this I could do. I can study the principles of psychology, human dynamics, but think about a business as my client versus a human person. And that just felt much, much better to me. And so, probably not surprisingly, it drove me down the path of HR. As you mentioned, I did work for American Express for several years ago. So, all of my history there is fairly dated at this point. But fundamentally, what I will say about that is amazing company, amazing brand, amazing
Yeah.
experiences and network. Not at all specific to American Express, but working inside of any giant global conglomerate. There's only so much change one person hanging somewhere in the middle of the org chart is ever going to be able to affect. And I felt
Yeah.
like I learned an unbelievable amount. I had tremendous mentors there. Many of my clients today are Amex alumni, but I really did feel like to impact change in workplaces, it's something you really do have to do from the outside. And so
Yeah.
that was what started me down the path of Lead Above Noise, which I'm almost at the 10-year mark on running.
Wow. It's funny that you
Yeah.
mentioned you didn't have the maturity to be an individual therapist. Were you just kind of like laughing at people? They'd come in there with your problems and you'd be like, ah, ha, 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 ha. That's what you're dealing with?
I mean, that's what I'm still doing, and I feel it's inappropriate to do that from a
You just don't
therapist's
say
chair.
it. You keep it on the inside, right?
In all seriousness, I kind of felt like it's a lot to look at somebody really struggling and show up in a room as some sort of authority, some sort of figure of stability. I didn't feel like I was either of those things, not necessarily on a personal front. So
Yeah.
organizationally, I feel much more confident.
Yeah. And it's a fun space to be in. There's a lot of cool companies and fun work out there. Well, why don't we start with some of the big workforce trends that maybe you were paying attention to, that your clients are asking you about, that you're aware of? Obviously, there's a lot of crazy stuff happening in the world right now. Whether you look at a company like Boeing and their pieces of their plane falling out of the sky, or whether you look at ChatGPT, or whether you look at generative AI, work from home, coming into the office. What's kind of top of mind for you as far as trends?
I mean, at the highest level, the working world feels like the Wild West right now,
Yeah.
right? I mean, everybody is making predictions and assumptions. And I know there are some people who feel like this actually isn't that different than any other big time in history when there was some sort of breakthrough, technological or otherwise. That may be true, but I beg to disagree. I think we are at an extraordinarily watershed moment in the world of work. And I think people are struggling to figure it out. People at every level, citizens, individual contributors, up to C-level executives. People are struggling to figure out what matters most, what is most important. I think one of the big questions today has become, from an organizational perspective, what do we owe people? And from people's perspectives, what can I expect from my organization? Because I
Mm.
feel like workplace, or I should say, expectations of workers in the workplace have been amplified, and organizations are feeling a little bit, I'll say, overwhelmed and intimidated by understanding how many of those expectations they need to meet.
Yeah.
That's a big one right now.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So maybe we could talk a little bit more about that too, in terms of expectations and kind of balancing what organizations are looking for versus what employees are looking for. So why don't you dive into a little bit into more detail into that as far as what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. So each of my parents, they finished school back in their day, and they each took a job, and then that was just their job
Yep.
forever until they were finished. My dad's actually still working. And that was, not necessarily everybody's experience in that generation, but that was not atypical, right? And there was sort of, I think we called it the psychological contract, or this unwritten understanding between people and organizations that I will come work for you forever, and you will keep me here forever, and you will pay me, and I will work hard, and everybody will go home and do our own thing, right? And I feel like that could not be further from where we are today. I think that organizations don't necessarily want people expecting lifelong employment, both because the economic reality is we can't necessarily make that promise, and
Hmm.
also I think there's room for kind of talent refreshing and turning over and bringing in new ideas and melding with old ideas. And so there's the organizational side of it, which is we don't want you to think you're going to be here forever. And then there's the employee side, which is, I'm not going to stay here forever, but for as long as I'm here, I want to be. I want to be paid this way. I want to be made to feel this way. I want to have these conversations. There's a lot going on. And I think the pandemic did a lot of this for
Oh
us.
yeah.
There's a lot happening in terms of people just wanting more out of work. I want more purpose. I want more safety. I want my health and wellness at the forefront. I want my physical wellness, my emotional wellness. I want to feel included. I want to be talking about the war in Ukraine. I want to be I want you, my company, to, send out memos and communications and take a stand, and I want you taking a stand on social justice and also doing right by the environment. And I'm not saying that any of these asks or expectations are reasonable or not reasonable. They are just many.
Yeah.
And I think organizations are sitting with this question of how many of those things should we be doing? Do we need to do?
And can
And
we
it's
do
just gotten
them?
really, can we? Absolutely. That's totally fair. And I think it's just gotten overwhelming for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, there's a lot going on there, as far as what employees are wanting and asking for. And my dad actually just retired from the workforce fairly recently, a couple days. Well, at the time we're
Congratulations.
recording this podcast, he retired. I think yesterday he actually went in
Oh,
and gave his computer and gave his badge and everything. So is officially retired. But he worked at this company for I think over 20 years, and then he worked at
yeah.
a previous company also for like 10, 15 years, and he's never had this idea. The idea of working 2 to 3 years at a single company was very foreign to him, and now it's so commonplace for everybody. And there's also a big debate. I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. Is an organization like a family, or is it as a team? Because some people still believe very much in this. It's a family. We're going to try to keep you here as long as we can. Whereas other organizations are like, no, we get it. You're going to be here like 2, 3 years, and then you're out, and then we're cool with that. Where do you stand on that?
I am a team. I am team on that one. I think there is a real danger on both sides when people in the workplace think of it as a family. I think I understand why people aspire to feel that way, and yet I feel we are all set up to experience some real heartbreak and failure when we go in with that expectation. I think you may have said on my podcast, your family doesn't fire you. And the reality
Yeah.
in the workplace today is that layoffs happen. They are a part of business, whether we like it or not. And we have to, on both sides, we have to be ready for that. I think when leaders are trying to cultivate family, it makes it harder to make those hard decisions. It makes it harder to give feedback. It makes it harder to drive results and hold people accountable. And on the flip side, when employees think of work as a family, it it's a real punch in the gut when hard decisions do get made, when there are
Yeah.
layoffs, when a colleague is let go. So I just think that I think there are ways to cultivate really warm communal feelings in the workplace that are not meant to duplicate or replicate the experience of being a family.
It seems like the family is more aspirational, but the team is more practical and realistic of what's happening. So, we want it to be a
Yes.
family, but the reality is that we're all a part of a team. And it's kind of nice, PR spin and lingo to tell everybody it's a family. But yeah, it's very rare now where you talk to a company where employees say that they've been there for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. It's kind of like, 2, 3 years and people are on their way out. Any other trends that are top of mind for you that you're paying attention to?
Um, I mean, there's definitely we're seeing a lot about, in-person versus remote, 4-day versus 5-day.
Yeah, that's a huge one. I just talked to somebody right now where she was telling me a lot of her employees want to do a 4-day work week, and she's kind of like, "What
Mhm.
are you people talking about here?" So where do you stand on the in-person versus virtual? When you're talking to different organizations out there, what are you telling them? Did you know that 96% of the people who watch videos on this channel are not subscribed? Do me a favor. Subscribe to this YouTube channel so that you can get access to more videos just like this. It literally takes you 1 second and it helps the channel quite a lot.
I think it's a lot like sort of government policy. You think about we have laws and laws are there for a reason, but no matter what the law is, you can always find an exception that makes that law seem unreasonable or unfair or inhumane. But at
Yep.
the end of the day, we do sort of need these policies, right? So I don't know, it's really interesting. I find so as one example, I run a cohort-based program for this one organization. It is 5 modules. The first 4 modules are hosted virtually. The fifth happens in person. I think I've run 6 cohorts through it, and oh, far and away, everybody's favorite part of this program is that in-person experience. It is absolutely, we can accomplish so much. We can be very highly productive in a virtual way, but there is something hard to quantify and hard to measure, but very, very real and impactful about coming physically together for a purpose.
Hmm.
That is real. On the flip side, I spent some time with a friend this weekend she works for a large organization. She is part of a globally dispersed team. She is now required to commute an hour each way 3 times a week and interacts with literally 0 people in the office she is physically in. So she's
Yeah.
driving an hour to sit in a phone booth and be on Zoom calls all day. There's literally no functional purpose for
Yeah.
her to be there. And I think
That's just dumb. That
it's terrible.
yeah.
It's terrible.
Whoever's
And so I
forcing her to
think
do that should have a stern talking to.
I would love their number. But I think that we need to help leaders kind of find the tools and the confidence and the comfort to make better in the moment decisions
Yeah.
and offer guidance and a range of flexibility. I think it's fair to set some expectations and have some accountability. Personally, I think the organizations that very early in the pandemic came out and said nobody's ever going to have to come back to our offices ever again. I think that was a really way too early decision, and I think it wasn't necessarily the right one, and I think it backfired in some cases.
Oh, yeah, I think that's a
But I
long-term
also
long-term mistake. It seems good in the short term,
totally.
but the idea, I mean, it sounds cool to tell everybody you
It was
never need
good
to come into an
PR.
office.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's great
Yes.
for PR, and employees are gonna be like, "Oh my God, that's fantastic! I never need to show up to work." But I think you're gonna kill your innovation. I think you're gonna have worse
Totally.
leaders at the company. I think you're gonna struggle long term, for sure. It's funny. There was I don't know if you're familiar with this law that they're trying to pass in California, which I think is one of the dumbest laws I've heard. It's Assembly Bill 2751. I think Matt Haney is in San Francisco who's trying to pass this law, which basically states that workers will have the ability to not have to respond to emails, phone calls, or texts after work hours. And it's going to be against the law for an organization to reach out to you after work hours. And I think that's one of the dumbest things I've heard because you can't have both ways, right? You can't have work life integration where you're
Mhm.
basically telling people we're integrating work and life. You can have the flexibility. Sometimes you can work in the evening. Sometimes you can work during the day. Sometimes you come in. Sometimes you don't. But at the same time, tell people that if we reach out to you after 5 o'clock, you're going to have the ability to sue us or take legal action, or we're going to have to pay a fine. That might work if you assume that everybody is working only from 8 to 5 every single day, and beyond that, you do not have to work. But that's not the world that we live in anymore. And so telling
Right.
people, and sometimes problems happen after work, right? You know, if you're in IT or if you're in customer service and support, you do have challenge and issues and problems that sometimes there is an emergency. So I think some people are taking it to the extreme, right? Where to the point where we want to make it illegal to get in touch with employees after 5 o'clock, which I think is insane.
Wow. Especially when we are a globalized workforce. I mean, that's a really challenging thing to manage. My comment on that, and I think you live in California, right? We talked
Yes.
about this?
Yes.
Yes.
California
And they
has
say
plenty of its own problems, which is a whole separate podcast.
that's fair. And they say what happens in California generally the rest of the company or the country follows. So I'll stay tuned on this.
Yeah,
But
let's hope.
you
Let's
know, my
hope not.
take on that is when we, the royal we, attempt to pass a law that feels really almost, I don't want to say ridiculous, but like almost ridiculous,
Yeah.
excessive, I think we are solving the wrong problem. So to me, it sounds like people are pushing for this type of legislation because they are so burned out and overwhelmed and they need to put a boundary down somewhere. And I think the problem to solve is not the post 5 p.m. because to your point that isn't realistic. I think we need to move a little bit earlier in that chain and under why are we so unprioritized and misaligned and so overwhelmed and overworked, and if we could make our work days feel a little bit more full of breath and air and life, we wouldn't need these rules that feel kind of arbitrary and unrealistic. So my take on that is I feel like we're solving the wrong problem there.
Yeah. Definitely solving the wrong problem. So I hope this doesn't pass. And I'm all for workplace flexibility and having some sense of personal life and work life, but to make it an official law is just completely wild. So getting back to this hybrid versus virtual, I think we're kind of on the same page there. There's certainly some value to in-person work. There's certainly some things like your friend. What's happening to your friend is completely ridiculous to be forced to commute an hour to sit on Zoom calls. But where do you
Yes.
think the future of this is going to end up? Because we're seeing some pushback from organizations. We're also seeing some pushback from employees. And it seems like there's this kind of the battle, the war of the worlds going on, so to speak. What's going to be the outcome of this?
I think it's going to be really interesting because, you and I chatted a little bit on my podcast about your hot take, which is listen, at the end of the day, like if you have ambitions to grow and move up within an organization, you probably need to be physically present and have some face time with those decision makers and be building your brand in person. And I think that is very real. And also, as much as I hate to stereotype, I do think that there is something real to some of the generational kind of stereotypes and research that's out there. And I do think as the boomers and eventually the Xers start to move out of the workplace and it really does become dominated by the millennials and ultimately Gen Z and whatever comes next, I think there's going to be the shorter term, long term, which is what you described, Jacob. I think in the next I don't know what the numbers are, but call it 10, 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there probably is going to be this expectation that for those who are going to climb and really be the the public facing leaders of our organization, you probably are going to need to be more in person. But I will be, as more and more millennials and ultimately Gen Zers start to step into those executive offices, I'll be curious to see what happens. I don't want to pretend I know the answers, but I think wherever we are in 10 years is not the end.
Yeah. Let's hope not. Let's hope not. Let's hope that's not the end. Yeah, I mean, there's some things to be optimistic about, and there are other things that kind of freak me out sometimes when we think about this the new the new leaders that are entering our organizations. But hopefully, it'll be more positive than it will be negative. But it's also the way that we think about organizations is also changing. There used to be a time, kind of like we were talking about with my parents and in your family as well, where you would just work for an organization, and it was just understood that the organization would give you a salary, they would pay your 401k benefits and stuff like that, but there was no expectation that the organization was your friend. There was no
Right.
expectation that the organization was going to provide you well-being programs or give you
Mhm.
free food or all these things. And and today we have this expectation, which we can talk about whether it's good or not, or realistic or unrealistic, where the organization is like it's supposed to be your best friend. And I don't think that's what the purpose of an organization is. And I think if you start working for a company as a new employee thinking that this company is going to be your best friend, you're going to be very upset when your friend eventually breaks up with you because you're not able to deliver or when the company is going through a tough time. And today, the expectations for organizations are crazy. The health and well-being programs, financial literacy. We want to have a gym on site. We want free food. We want yoga. We want great benefits. We want a great salary. We want to have work-life balance. We don't want to work too hard, but we want to work just hard enough. It's to the point where I'm not sure how sustainable and realistic the expectations that some of us have of these organizations really is. And part of me thinks we just need to get back to a little bit more of the basics, right? The organization is not your friend. The organization is
Right.
paying you to do something and you should do it and you'll be treated well, but you shouldn't have this expectation of like, you're gonna do it's not Pinocchio's island, basically. And I think we've swung so much to that pendulum that I don't know. It just seems not sustainable in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, it is tricky. I mean, I'll say a couple things on that. The first is that, to your point, in our parents' day, they just went to work and came home, and their expectations were limited. But so was the organization's access to them. There
Yeah.
was no working after 5 p.m. because we hadn't invented virtual work yet, right? So, the expectations of employers on employees is also much bigger now. I know when I work with global clients, I mean, for all the things that we have innovated on and all this technology, the one problem we have not solved is time zones.
Yeah.
I'm desperate for that to happen, but being a company headquartered in the US, engaging with APAC is nearly impossible unless some party is never rested. And for people who work in Asia for US based companies, there's just no good solution, right? So I think there's a little bit of like the expectations on employees are also increasing. The other piece of it, though, is that, and I said this even back when I was at American Express, which was still in we were certainly online and kind of moving into more digital minded products and programs. Through our parents' whole generation, I think the expectation was you go to work and you kind of do what your boss told you to do, but mostly your boss knew more than you because they'd been there longer, they were
Yeah.
more senior, so they would tell you what to do and you would go do it. Now we've moved into this era where there is absolutely like a wisdom and an intelligence and an experience at the top of a hierarchy that is so important, and they should be visioning and setting direction. But also, you know, the I'm s- I'm just gonna say it, the middle-aged white guys, the aging white guys at the top aren't necessarily, they're not the digital natives. They're not the ones who are living in this world of inclusion and diversity and how do we connect in a digital way? And so what leaders today need to be doing, unlike in our parents' day when it was really just about issuing instructions and giving feedback, nowadays leaders need to be creating conditions in which they can actually learn from their teams. There is just as much intelligence and insight at the bottom of an org chart as at the top. And so all of that alchemy has shifted. And so I think, there's more expected of employees than ever before. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I swear I will breathe, is that I also, when we talk about all these benefits, I want workplace massages and I want this and I want that, but I also want work life balance, et cetera. I think part of what organizations need to be doing is really thinking about the impact of some of these programs. So, which of these programs, and I'm, speaking as a woman, as a mother, for me, thank goodness for some of these programs. My mother never got to have the career that men of her generation had
Yeah.
because the workplace didn't really allow for that, didn't really sustain that. And I'm talking about that generation. Today, we see working moms, working dads, we see all different iterations of that. But I think that companies need to think about which of these programs is actually allowing us to cultivate a more diverse, more equitable workforce versus which of these are just I call them the sizzle factors or the sexy extras, the massages and the food and the sort of the things that they're fun, but they're not really infusing any kind of value.
Hmm.
I think we just need to be a little bit more thoughtful in assessing the different offerings in that way.
Yeah. You also mentioned DEI, which I'm curious to get your
Mhm.
thoughts on because this is a hot topic, very polarizing
Mhm.
topic, a lot of debate on
Yeah.
this topic, especially now. Um, so, what are your thoughts and what's your take on DEI more broadly speaking? And then maybe we can dive deeper in some of it.
Yeah, sure. So the very first thing I want to say is I do not claim expertise in this arena. So I am here as a human, as a woman, as a Jewish person,
Me
which
too.
feels very relevant.
Minus the
Okay.
woman part, but as a Jewish person.
That is fair. And that really has become part of things, right? So I consider myself an active participant in this conversation. I do not stand as an expert in the realm of DEI. But what I will say is I know it intuitively as many of us do, and I respect the data out there that says genuinely organizations that I'm not talking about diversity scorecards and managing quotas, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
organizations that legitimately create pipelines and spaces for leaders of a genuine diversity of backgrounds to not just show up and have a seat at the table, but actively participate in and influence the conversation. They are more successful across the board. I don't think there's any denying that. And I think it is a real shame that in some parts of the country and the world, we're even still having to have the conversation about why diversity and inclusion and equity are important.
Hmm.
I think they are a no brainer from both a human perspective, but also a business perspective. And I'm almost, and I hate to say this, but I'm almost in a place where I don't want to talk to leaders anymore who are still asking the question of why, because if you haven't found your way there yet, I don't know that you will. I'm interested in talking to leaders who want to better understand how. And again, I am not necessarily the expert there, but I can absolutely sort of play a partnership role and help navigate that conversation.
Yeah, I think there's two sides to it as well, right? To your point, you mentioned scorecards and quotas. I think that's where a lot of the big push for DEI, or the pushback, I should say, from DEI is coming from. Is there's a perception that a lot of organizations out there, and there have been several that have come to light, and academic institutions and medical institutions, which are talking about scorecards, which are talking about, for example, if you are white, they're not going to review your academic papers versus if you are a minority, you will. And I think that's where a lot of the pushback is coming from. But actually, a lot of the CHROs that I'm interviewing are telling me that they view diversity and equity and inclusion as a way to expand their talent pool, but not in a way that reduces their standards in any way, and not in a way that prioritizes one group over another. They just view it as a way to broaden their talent pool. But then the question becomes, well, if you're in HR and you're doing a good job focusing on hiring people, why do you need a DEI team to begin with? Shouldn't that just be a part of HR? Shouldn't that just be a part of your role, is to expand your talent pool and to get the best possible people for the role, and to look in different areas where you can find great people? Like, why do you need a chief DEI officer? Why do you need a DEI team? And I think that's where there's a lot of debate and pushback, because I'm kind of in the same camp as you, right? I agree that I think if you have teams of diverse perspectives, diverse views, that those teams are going to be more effective. But at the same time, I'm also not a fan of scorecards. I'm also not a fan of quotas. I'm also not a fan of lowering standards. I'm also not a fan of prioritizing somebody over somebody else just because of how they look, or just because of where they come from or what they believe in. Like, I still very much believe in, you still have to do a good job, but we don't want everybody on the team who believes the same thing, right? We don't want a team of yes men or yes women, or people who all have the same perspective on something. We want that mix. And so I think the future of DEI is going to be very much interesting to pay attention to, because you have people like Elon Musk who are saying DEI must die. And there are people like Coleman Hughes and Christopher Rufo who've written books on this. And then you have people like Mark Cuban who are on the exact opposite side of the DEI debate. So it's very, very interesting. It's a tough space to be in, I think, for a lot of HR people and for a lot of leaders out there.
Yeah, and I think what you're describing, right? Why should you need a chief diversity officer? Shouldn't it just be embedded in your practices? I think and I hope, and I may get some kind of slam back for this, but I think that that should be the ideal, right? And I think that my hope personally is that we don't need a diversity office in organizations someday because we will have successfully embedded the infrastructure in organizations that we need to not need to separate out that office. I think part of the problem today and in the past, 10, 20 years, however long this has really been present, is that a lot of the infrastructure in the organizations isn't ready to successfully diversify, right? So in the earlier days, organizations may have been focusing on recruiting women, on recruiting ethnic minorities. We'd bring them into the organization, but then it was still predominantly the white men who were making the bulk of the decisions because that's how organizations were built and wired, right? And so until organizations can start to shift their interior practices so that voices of introverts have a place and it's not just the extroverts. There are very actual realities about different populations. There's that I don't remember who did it, but there's that study out there that says that you post a job, and again, this is kind of broad strokes, but you post a job with 10 key criteria, and a man will look at that and say, well, I've got 5 of them, I'm going to go for it. And a woman looks at it and says, well, I only have 9, so I'm obviously not qualified, right? And so the problem is until organizations have that awareness and have that understanding, by default, they're going to have more men applying to these jobs. And so then they're going to recruit more men. And so there really is a need to shift how we manage internally, how we facilitate conversations, how we make decisions. And I think until we get there, there probably will be a need for diversity offices and scorecards on the journey. And where that sort of tipping point is, I don't know.
If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably interested in excelling in your career. You're probably interested in trying to figure out how to become a better leader, how to engage your employees, how to create a future-ready organization. Now, this podcast might get you some of the way there, but if you're interested in stepping up your game even further, then I invite you to head over to greatleadership.substack.com. Join the community of tens of thousands of people from around the world who are getting weekly insights, CEO interviews, in-depth articles that I write, bonus leadership hacks from best-selling authors and CEOs around the world. All of this content is available at greatleadership.substack.com. Well, for people who are watching and listening, I'd be very curious to hear your feedback. So they can leave a comment if they're watching on YouTube or email me. Very curious to hear what everyone thinks. I know a lot of organizations have DEI officers in executive roles, but I think this is going to be a very, very interesting space to watch over the coming years to see how it evolves and what happens and how strong the pushback is and whether the pro-DEI people will win. And we'll see. Why don't we switch gears a little bit and talk about, I guess, something tangential to this, which is leadership development programs and why so many of them fail. And I hear this from countless executives inside of organizations where they have leadership development programs, but then they still struggle at the same time to have great leaders. You would think that any company that has a good leadership development program and people go through it, they would end up having great leaders. That's what the point of the program is. Yet we still see such high levels of disengagement. We still see that the number one reason for disengaged employees is their direct manager, their supervisor. So what is going on with these programs? Are we just wasting the billions of dollars every year that we spend on this?
In some cases, yes. But I will say this. I think leadership development is a tremendously important lever, both in terms of demonstrating your investment and your commitment to your employees and helping them feel valued, but also as an enabler of organizational results. I think the problem with leadership development, and I think there are some foundational problems. The first, in my experience, and I do a lot of work in this space, and I'll say the first big problem is that I find that sometimes organizations are throwing money at leadership development to solve a problem when the actual problem is in the guts of the organization, right? So the best leadership program in the world is not going to solve for the fact that your C-level executives are not aligned. They're not
Yeah.
collaborating. They're not communicating. So at the end of the day, if you have organizational dysfunction, which we all do, by the way, a leadership development program, the best in the world, is not going to overcome that. So I think that's the first problem. You can only give people leadership skills that they can demonstrate if the organization makes space for it. So we have to look at our organizational dysfunction and find ways to solve it. The second thing, and this has been a real learning journey for me. So, like I said, I'm coming up on 10 years in with Lead Above Noise. I've been doing leadership development that whole time, and what I will say is, in the earliest days of my work, I don't know what the numbers were, but I want to say maybe my programs were largely 70% content, 30% other stuff, interaction, debate, exercises, etc. And I have shifted completely the other way, perhaps even
Mm.
more so. I think that leadership development is still too often seen as a transmission of knowledge and
Yeah.
information. And yet, I find it pretty rare that I meet a leader these days who, let's say, doesn't effectively coach because they've never learned a coaching framework. I guarantee you, every leader out there has learned a coaching framework. They are not coaching for some other reason. They don't have the time, they don't have the confidence, they've not had the practice, they don't have the tools, they don't have a cohort of peers that they can role play with. There are a million reasons. And so for me, leadership development is spend a few minutes teaching a tool, a concept, a framework, but really we need to be dialing up the practice, the acknowledgement of how do we create the time and space for this, the room to practice and role play and talk about, all right, we know this is like an external framework, but let's all talk about inside this organization why it's so hard, and let's problem solve that. Let's hold each other accountable. Let's know that when we go out and use it the first time, it's going to feel horrible, but let's have a safe space to come back to where we can sort of break it down and, Jacob, here's what I said and here's what he said and it was awful. Like, can you give me some advice? And so I think leadership development is just a little bit about learning, and it's so much about practice and accountability. It is about building a community of peers who are learning together. Um, and so I think those are the two things organizations need to be focusing on. What do we need to do in terms of our organizational health to allow our leaders to lead? And then two, how do we build programs that are a little bit about teaching, but much more about practicing and having accountability and having a community of leaders that we can depend on to support each other?
So how would that manifest? Let's say you were advising a company or you were building a leadership
Yep.
development and training program. So what would that mean? Because obviously there are some courses, there are some frameworks and stuff like that that you alluded to, which people need to learn stuff. How does the rest of that kind of manifest as far as practicing, taking, having the space to be able to do that? How
Mhm.
do you give that time and that space to do that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So again, the first thing, if an organization comes to me and says, "Hey, we need a program on delegation because our leaders are really bad at delegating," the first thing I would do is I would have some conversations with leaders around, like, talk to me about why you're not delegating. And almost never is the answer, "Oh, I didn't know I was supposed to," or I don't know how. It's There are always reasons why not. And so I think the first way it manifests is getting a little bit of feedback back to the sponsors of a program to say, "Yep, we're going to run this program and we're going to create some momentum, but here's some of your accountability as a senior leader within this organization.
Yeah.
You need to create more room for failure that generated learning, and you need to create more airtime for more junior people on the org chart to present in meetings," right? So there's the feedback up to the top of the organization to help them understand where they need to make changes. But then within the context of the program, like I said, I love running these cohort-based programs. So you have a single cohort of people that come together, once a month over 6 months or twice a month, whatever it is, but they come together periodically. And so the way that we run people through a program, if we're talking about delegation, we sort of bring them together in the beginning. We talk about why delegation matters. I think the first thing we have to do is help. Sometimes we throw all this, you have to be coaching and delegating and giving feedback, and it's overwhelming and exhausting. And
Yeah.
so, helping leaders understand, how is this going to actually help you do your job better? Here's how we get you bought in. Then we're going to teach you the framework, but then we're going to have you actually go into a breakout, and we're going to have you actually share in that breakout a time that you delegated and it backfired. You're going to talk a little bit about that. You're going to get a little feedback from your peers. We're going to come back together. you're going to choose something here in this room that you are going to try delegating before the next time we come back together. And we teach a framework that is, I call it developmental. So part of it is we tend to think delegation is a binary. I did or I didn't. What about delegating one small piece? What about making sure you're choosing the right person to delegate to? So we sort of talk through all of these levers, all of your areas of accountability. And then we ask you to choose one thing that you're going to put into action. Not, I'm going to delegate this entire client pitch to the new guy on my team, but you know what? I am going to choose one project and one person. And before the next meeting, I'm going to write down 3 reasons why I think this is the right person and how I'm going to set them up for success. That's
Yeah.
your only accountability before the next session. And then we build upon that over time. So by the time you leave the program, you have this strong capability, but it's not like you came in, we taught you a framework, you went back and didn't use it. And well, obviously that program failed.
Yeah, then it's kind of a waste. No, that approach makes a lot more sense. I want to shift gears again because we have like 15 minutes left here to the Leaders Toolkit section where we talk about the practical and actionable stuff. And I wanted to go over your framework. How would you describe the framework? Is this a framework to activate teams inside of organizations? Is that kind of how you describe it?
Yes,
Okay.
a framework to activate teams.
Okay. So activating teams, I guess we could think of this is a framework for how to make sure that your teams are performing at their maximum potential, so to speak. And so we're going to go over these 4 actions, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I see you're shaking your head a
No,
little bit
no,
there.
you're good.
So this 4-step framework to activate teams, deliver, develop, connect, and thrive. So why don't we go through what this framework actually is, and perhaps we can spend 1 to 2 minutes on each one of them, and you can explain what it is and maybe some action items that people can take for each one of those. My conversation with Rachel Cooke continues only for subscribers of Great Leadership Plus on Apple Podcasts. And if you hate ads as much as I hate ads, you are going to love this subscription because not only will you get access to bonus episodes from my amazing guests like Rachel, but you are also going to get ad-free listening. And if you subscribe right now, you will get this bonus episode with Rachel, where we go over this 4-pillar framework she has for how to activate teams inside of your organization. And the 4-pillar framework we're going to be talking about is deliver, develop, connect, and thrive. So if you want to learn more about what that is and how it works and get ad-free listening, then I encourage you to subscribe on Apple Podcasts to Great Leadership Plus. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with somebody who you think can become a better leader as well. Thanks for tuning in. I will see you next week.